Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 7, and this is Session 19. Let me pick up right at the end of the last lesson, where Moses obviously thought God was going to immediately deliver the people out of Egypt. But he didn't. And of course, we read this scripture. What did Moses do? Well, Exodus 5:22, Moses returned unto the Lord and said, I'm sorry. Just let that keep going, Mark, because you know what? Well, you know what? It's too late, isn't it? I'll do it next one. Man, I cannot think. And Moses returned unto the Lord and said, Lord, I know how that sounded on the tape. And Moses said, I cannot think. I just thought about how that sounded. I'm sorry. And actually, you know what? That was a Freudian slip because he couldn't think. I'm going to show you why in just a moment. Moses returned unto the Lord and said, Lord, wherefore hast thou so evil entreated this people? Why is it thou hast sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he hath done evil to this people, neither hast thou delivered thy people at all. He is complaining. Would you not agree that he is complaining because he obviously thinks that God was going to deliver the people immediately, correct? Now, here's a verse I didn't show you last time. It's not in your notes, the notes I printed up for you, but I just want to show you this. So just look with me here on the PowerPoint. This is back when God was speaking to Moses before he ever went back. And he says this, Exodus 7:2. Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. Now, by the way, stop right there. This is interesting, isn't it? He says, Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh. Did you ever get the idea that it was Moses that was speaking to Pharaoh? Now, Moses is going to say it, but evidently it's Aaron that's going to give the message to Pharaoh. You're going to see why about that in just a moment. It's very interesting. And it says, verse 3, And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt, but Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you. That sounds pretty obvious, doesn't it? That I may lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth mine armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. This issue, by the way, Moses, he should know now. He's not going to just do it. I'm going to harden his heart, and he's not going to listen. It seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? Okay, but now let's go back to this first issue. And Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh. I want you to look in Exodus 7:1 with me here. And this is very interesting. And the Lord said unto Moses, See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. That's an interesting thing for God to say, isn't it? I have made thee a god to Pharaoh. And you know, it's sort of like, yeah, Moses is saying something, but he's not the one talking to Pharaoh. Just like when God was going to speak to Israel, who did he send? He sent his prophets to speak for him. The Lord spoke to the prophet, and the prophet spoke to the people. This is the way. Now, they're both standing in front of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh sees Moses. And by the way, I mean, you know, it's not like nobody doesn't know who he is, but there he is. But Aaron's the one doing the talking, and he's setting this up to do this. Now, why in the world is he doing that? Well, there's something that you need to understand, and that is, in the eyes of the Egyptian people, each Pharaoh was a reincarnation of the god Horus. And they looked at the Pharaoh as though he were a god. So you know what it's about? So now, he says, so you could say it this way. To the Egyptians, Pharaoh is a god. And now God says, and I'm going to make thee a god unto Pharaoh. It's almost like, and there's more to it than you think, this is a contest between gods. And it really is a contest between gods. This is going to get more involved. So I've set you up for that here. I just want you to kind of think about that, because we're going to follow this up, because God's going to make some statements to Moses about this. All right, so why didn't God deliver the people immediately? And we already know it's because He had a secondary purpose. And in that secondary purpose, there was a message that He was sending. And so, let me just give you, in this message, He is sending a message that is really intended to 4 different sets of ears. There's 4 different, not 4 different parts to the message, but there's 4 different groups that God is speaking to here. The first one is He is sending a message to the people of Israel. The second one is He is sending a message to the people of Egypt. Now I'm going to show you very quickly some verses about all of this, but He is also sending a message to the whole world. And in the last part, what we'll look at is He is sending a message to Satan. All of those are important. So let's take these one at a time and kind of work our way through them. So Exodus chapter 10 and verse 1. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart, and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs before him, and that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son, and of thy son's son, what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that you may know how that I am the Lord. Now, just looking at that, you understand that He's saying, what I'm going to do here in Egypt is something that you're going to see, but not only you're going to see it, but you're going to tell it in the ears of your son, and in the ears of your son's son. In other words, this is meant to be handed down through the generations here, that they remember what got done here, for the purpose of, after that last semicolon, that ye may know how that I am the Lord. Let's talk about that just for a moment, because this is the issue here. The I am issue. There's another way to describe that. Let's see if this marker is any better. And that is the... It's not. I'm sorry, that's getting lighter and lighter, isn't it? Look in my case, and babe, and see if there's a marker in there. I know. Yeah, here, this is better. Never mind. Well, okay. Jehovahness and grace. That is that I am concept, where God says, I am. And remember all those Jehovah, when I call this Jehovahness, I'm talking about all of those compound Jehovah names. You recall those. We did those back when we went through this the first time. Jehovah Jireh, remember Jehovah Nissi, Jehovah Rophika. Those were the things that God was going to do for them that they could not do for themselves, and He wanted them to see Him just that way. Now, when He says that ye may know how that I am the Lord, in other words, He's saying, I want you to see this and understand who I am and what I can do. I want you to rehearse it to your sons and your sons' sons, so that they also have that testimony. Look at this next one. And this is Exodus chapter 29:46. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, that brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. He doesn't just keep saying that for poetry. You know, there are those that teach the Bible and they look at things like that and they want to talk about a poetic style in the Bible. He is emphasizing who He is. This is the I am that I am. Remember when He said that to Moses? So this is that very important. I keep saying that, and I don't know. This is one of those things that I say over and over and over, but I have a feeling that sometimes when these things go out, people don't really appreciate the depth of what I'm trying to say here. That issue of God's Jehovah-ness and grace being taught to Israel is one of the absolute, most fundamental, primary, necessary, non-optional things they must come to understand and embrace if they are ever going to become the great nation God intends for them to be. They're going to have to come to grips with that. That's not a minor issue. So sometimes when you're listing things, remember I told you when we were talking about the Old Testament prophets and there were 7 major doctrinal issues that were set forth in the prophets. The number one issue was the issue of God's Jehovah-ness and grace. That's one of the main issues that the prophets are setting forth. That thing is huge. Now, I'm not going to get carried away anymore on that, except to say this. And I put this on the PowerPoint because I wanted us to understand. I'm not going to step aside now and reteach about God's Jehovah-ness and grace. I'm just going to remind you of one issue, and here it is. Time is not an issue to God as far as fulfilling what He says He will do. God is a God of time, but time is not an issue with Him fulfilling His promises. And what I'm saying by that is, no matter how long, what was the primary reason for sending Moses to Egypt when he was in Midian? And he remembered he saw the burning bush on Mount Horeb, which was Mount Sinai. And the Lord tells him, hey, I'm going to send you back over there and you're going to what? What's He going to do? Thank you. He's going to deliver the people out of Egypt and they're going to go into the land of Canaan, the land of promise. But we know that there is a secondary thing that God is doing. And just to kind of sum it all up, God is sending a message. I know it's His signs and wonders, but by those signs and wonders, He is sending a message to Israel, to Egypt, to the entire world, and especially to the adversary. But here's what He's saying. This first thing, the thing that I'm going to do, the thing that Moses thought, hey, I went before Pharaoh and you didn't deliver us. In fact, it got worse for us. God's saying, hey, I got this thing I want to do here, but no matter how long this takes, it does not mean that my desire to accomplish this has subsided or waned to any degree. I'm still as committed as ever to doing what I said I would do. So time is not an issue to God. He is going to do what He said, and just because large amounts of time has passed doesn't mean God's going, well, I'm rethinking it. He's still committed to delivering them. Think about that. Think about that with regard to why we're over here in the first place. Because in Romans chapter 9 and verse 14, you have the charge that God is dealing with Israel in an unrighteous way. Why? Because He didn't complete what He was doing with them. Remember back in Romans chapter 9 and verse, 3 or 4, I can't remember now. Anyway, remember that list of things where Paul talks about the things that are going to be happening in the fulfillment of what God is doing with the program when he says, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption, the glory. Remember, and he went through that whole list, and he talked about the promises and the giving of the law and the service of God and the covenant. He said all of that is going to come to an apex out there in the kingdom, and Israel's looking at all the things that Paul listed, and they're saying, we haven't gotten that yet. That hasn't happened. And so God has stopped working with us, and He's gone to work with those Gentiles, and they're charging Him with being unfair, with being unrighteous, because he didn't keep his promise. And so Paul, remember, he is now in verse 15, he gives them an answer to that objection when he talks about something that's going on with Moses after they're delivered out of Egypt. But now, in verses 16 and 17, he is giving us another answer to that objection by talking about something that's going on with Pharaoh before they're delivered out of Egypt. Now, I'm just making the connection as to jog our memory a little bit about why we're over here right now. So when he says, I'm giving you this message so that you'll know who I am and what I'm going to do. And that testimony will be for your kids and your grandkids. And just to back this up, so that they will know that I am the Lord their God that brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. That I'm the... You look at that and you want to say, well, that's just overkill, isn't it? But it's not, because when they get out of there and Moses goes up on Mount Sinai to get the tables of stone, what do they do? They bring their gold to Aaron and they make a golden calf. And you know what he says to them? These be thy gods which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. God knows. He's trying to establish His Jehovahness and grace with them. Okay, so now, having said that, there are many instances in the Bible where this secondary thing... By the way, okay, let me finish this point. You didn't get me off, I did. Because of what Paul is doing here, he is taking us back to that issue. Because for Israel, the whole idea is to understand, if God has a second, you guys ought to know, if God has a secondary issue He is trying to accomplish, just because time is passing doesn't mean He's not going to fulfill His first purpose. He is. Because time, I'm sorry, where'd I go? Time is not an issue. He isn't losing interest. He hasn't changed his mind. Do you see? That's why Paul is bringing this up, to say to Israel, you think God is being unfair, but this is something you ought to be already familiar with. It's happened in your own program. Don't get to thinking that because this dispensation of grace, of Gentile grace, is coming along, that God is not going to give you the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the promises and that is all going to come. But don't get to thinking that because time is going by, that somehow He's not going to do it. He is. He has something else in this dispensation of Gentile grace that He is going to accomplish first. And when that's done, then that will be the proper time to go back to the first purpose and complete it. Do you see what Paul is... I'm trying to get... Okay, I think you get it, right? Do you see? That's the thing he's trying to say to them. That's why he brings it up. But when Paul says it in the verses 16 and 17... he doesn't go back and explain all of that because he thinks we already know all of that. So see, it's not really a rabbit trail. It's context. Okay, fine. All right, so let me give you a couple of other examples. God promises Abraham the land, right? He does. Do they get the land in Abraham's lifetime? How about Isaac's lifetime? How about Jacob's lifetime? When the descendants of Jacob, 70 souls, go down into Egypt because of the famine. Remember, Joseph is down there and they go down. They are there for 400 years. Someone could be looking back and saying, wait a minute, our father, Abraham, and it was the covenant was confirmed with his son Isaac and confirmed again with Jacob by the angel of the Lord to say, this land is going to be ours. When in the world are we ever going to get there? But time is not an issue with God. He has something else. There was a reason they were down there in Egypt all that time. Then when the time was done, God said, and I've got a purpose. I'm going to bring you out. Oh, but before I do that, I've got another purpose I'm going to accomplish at the same time that's necessary so that when you do come out, some things will be established that need to be established. So, that's really good because that means I could utilize that. Okay, I'm just thinking. Everybody with me? All right, so 400 years before they actually get the land. Over 400 years. Here's one. Abram is 75 years old when he first gets the message that he's going to have a son that's going to be an heir, and he's multiply his seed as the sand of the seashore and the stars of heaven. It is 10 years later. Abram is 75 when he hears the message. 10 years later, there's no son. By the way, he's 75. Guess how old Sarah is? She's 65. 10 years later, there is no heir. That's when they decide, when he's 85 and she's 75, she says, you need to have a son by my handmaid so that we can fulfill the promise of God. You know that was a mistake, but that's what happens. 14 years later, he is 99 and she is 89. And the Lord comes to them both and says, you, Sarah, are going to have a son next year about this time. So how old does that make them? He's 100 next year at about this time, and she's 90. See, here's the thing. God is showing you again, I am going to do what I said. And no matter how much time goes by, it has not changed my ability to deliver that. I am still going to get it done. I'll give you one more. And that is, in the days of the Messiah, can I just teach you something here that's kind of important? The days of the Messiah come in two parts. The first part is the meek and lowly aspect of the days of the Messiah, and that's during his earthly ministry before the cross. But then the second part of the days of the Messiah are what I want to call those. I think of the great and terrible day of the Lord. I mean, it's going to be where he returns at his advent, destroys his enemies and all of that. But that's that's the wrath and judgment issue. And so, why am I saying that to you? I had to think a second. Because during the meek and lowly days, by the way, when the prophets talked about these, they put both of those together when they talked, so that you got the feeling that one was following immediately on the heels of the first one. But when you look back, you find out that between this and this, we have had almost 2,000 years of a dispensation of Gentile grace. No wonder they're asking, where's the promise of His coming? Because you guys were back here preaching, it was at hand. You see how that is? All right. So that very important issue, and that's exactly why Moses and Abraham and some others are presented to the believing remnant who are going to be out there in that day of wrath to talk to them about the working of godly patience in their inner man. That's going to be an important aspect to them. In fact, take a look at this. Luke 21:19. In your patience possess ye your souls. Now I know I just lifted that verse out. I didn't give you any context. But look, without that godly patience worked in the little flock, then the policy of evil is going to convince them of the lie that it's promoting, and they're going to be deceived by it. They're going to have to learn to be patient. And that's why there are, look, I traced this through, and this was a rabbit trail. I traced this through, and I started to give you all these references in Hebrews that talks about, to the little, members of the little flock, be patient, be patient, be patient. And I'm not just talking about be patient in your flesh. He's saying, there's some things that are written back here that if they effectually work in you, they'll produce the kind of patience that you will need so that you won't get antsy and then start doubting and then start believing the lie. And this patience is there all the way through the book of Hebrews. But I omitted it because it was just a long list of verses. And all I did was the book of Hebrews. Now let me just tell you one thing about that because this is important. In Hebrews 11, which everybody understands, you know what, I even in Bible college, everybody called Hebrews 11 the faith chapter, right? By faith, Moses did this. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, that's what that whole chapter is about. Now look, I want to tell you, to me, this is very interesting. I'm just going to mention it to you, and then we're just going to go on. But Hebrews 11 mentions Abram as an example to the little flock twice. Once in Genesis chapter 11 when he was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. By faith, Abraham was called out of there and he journeyed to a place that he didn't know of. He did that by faith. The other one is in Genesis chapter 22. And that is 37 years later when he offers his son Isaac upon the altar. By faith, Abraham did those two things. Now, the only reason I'm pointing that out to you, good, I'll just finish this statement and then we'll pause and do the next one. But what's interesting about this is Hebrews mentions Genesis 11, journeying to the promised land. Genesis 22 about Isaac. Paul, when he writes to us in the dispensation of Gentile grace, he does refer to Abraham, but not out of Genesis 11 and not out of Genesis 22. He goes back to Abraham for Genesis chapter 15. And do you know what he is doing when he does that? We've already covered that. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for what? For righteousness. In other words, that was a salvation. In other words, Paul goes back to Abraham to talk about salvation by grace through faith. Hebrews never mentions Genesis 15. Paul never mentions Genesis 11 or 22. Isn't that interesting? How they do that? And here's why. Because Hebrews 11 is not written to tell the members of the little flock how to be saved. If they're members of the little flock, what? They're already saved. I mean, that makes sense, right? So here's the thing I'm getting to here at the end. Hebrews 11 is written to bring comfort to the little flock and equip them to go through that period of time in which they're living. That's what and that patience that they're going to need is going to be given to them by examples back there, that when they look at those scriptures and those things effectually work in them, hey, just like we're saying, we want all of that education to be effectually working in us, so that when we go cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light, we're going to be armored up against the attack of the adversary, so that we're not overcome by his attack. We want to be prepared. Well, the same thing is true for the members of the believing remnant of Israel out there in the day of wrath. They're going to need the effectual working of another doctrine in them to be able to withstand the things that are happening to them as they're running for their lives from the Antichrist. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting, that when you study that out, Paul goes to Genesis 15, Hebrews is telling a little flock, he never talk about that. But when they talk about Genesis 11 and 22, Paul never mentions those. I thought it was interesting, not so much for you. Okay, so let's stop here. All we're going to do is let that catch up on the recorders.